Wrestling has dedicated fans that follow every aspect of it. The hardcore fan base follow individual wrestling stories as well as WWE, AEW, and other companies. As a result, they are quite knowledgeable about the goings-on of the wrestling world. However, given the number of scandals also present, there are some that may have faded in their memories. With that in mind, let's take a look at some of the wrestling scandals that fans have probably forgotten about. Before we get into the rest of the video, don't forget to press that like button and make sure you subscribe to Wrestling Rambles with notifications on. In the midst of the many allegations that have surfaced against Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis, it's easy to forget that there were already issues with the pair of them in the past. The WWE Divas division was insane during the 2002 to 2005 period, with the likes of Lita, Trish Stratus, and Molly Holly having epic matches and rivalries. However, the company was still also focusing on women mostly as eye candy, something that had not changed at all from the Attitude Era. As a result, Dawn Marie and others were often put in storylines that didn't always make the most sense from a wrestling perspective, but rather to excite the viewers. Dawn Marie had an interesting storyline where she was in a relationship with Tori Wilson's father. However, outside the ring, she ended up in a situation of her own. She found out that she was pregnant and naturally had to go on maternity leave. Unfortunately though, while on maternity leave, she was fired from the company. It was because at this time it was heavily discouraged for women to become pregnant in the company, allegedly. The star ended up bringing a lawsuit against WWE claiming wrongful termination, and it ended up gaining a lot of negative publicity. It ended up changing how they dealt with maternity moving forward, and now the company is unlikely to ever fire someone because they are pregnant. The story has mostly been forgotten. WWE has now been sold by Vince McMahon, with the company merging with Endeavor's UFC to form TKO. Back in the day, though, the mere suggestion that Vince McMahon could actually sell his company was unbelievable. Even today, there are fans who can't believe he actually did it. However, investors are not always fans. Donald Trump was not always president, but was another of the US billionaires who was friends with Vince McMahon. Suddenly, there was a storyline that Trump had actually bought WWE Raw from Vince McMahon and that he was going to be running the show. It was naturally a kayfabe story to get the billionaire involved in WWE. The investors didn't get the note that this was the case, and they thought that the purchase had actually gone through. As a result, there was a panic with WWE stocks reacting heavily on the market. Vince McMahon had to quickly buy back WWE Raw the very next week. The original storyline for that had been much longer, but thanks to the scandal about the purchase, fans never got to see it play out how they wanted. Fans often remember Miss Elizabeth and Randy Savage as the perfect couple, even terming her the first lady of wrestling. She was beloved by the fans and the two were looked on as perfect. However, things were not always going to be as they were portrayed on the screen. The Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth had been in a relationship together for a time and they were married in 1984. However, things didn't work out between them, with the intensity of Randy Savage taking things too far too often, and they divorced in 1992. She then went on to get married to an attorney in 1997, but again, the marriage was short-lived and they divorced in 1999. At this time, she was managing Lex Luger and the two were a couple. They left WCW in 2000 and she worked as a front desk executive. She was supposed to appear with Luger in the wrestling ring again in November 2002. However, she never ended up appearing on another show. She was involved in a domestic fight with Luger, with police finding her with 2 bruised eyes as well as a bump on her head. Luger was charged and then later was arrested for a DUI. He even had a gun in his car, and Elizabeth went home alone. In 2003, on May 1st, just days after the arrest, Luger called 911 to let them know that Elizabeth was not breathing. She didn't respond to the best attempts by the emergency personnel, and they found out that she died at the age of 42 due to painkillers and vodka mixing. The entire matter was tragic, and suspicion lingered surrounding Luger, although he was distraught at what had happened. WWE was getting multiple heels ready to face Hulk Hogan, and Dr. D was one of them. At this time, David Schultz, aka Dr. D, was a heel, and kayfabe was also very alive. Most fans knew wrestling was scripted, but it was not common knowledge at the time. There were exposés surrounding wrestling at the time, and John Stossel was at the center of it. The reporter went backstage to find out what he could about the wrestling business and tried to interview David Schultz backstage at Madison Square Garden in 1984. Schultz was insulted by Stossel, and when the reporter said that he believed wrestling was fake, Schultz slapped him twice on camera across the head. Stossel ran off. Unfortunately, Schultz was suspended because of the incident, and he was fired by WWE eventually. He would claim that WWE management wanted him to hit Stossel later. WWE and Stossel settled their lawsuit out of court. With the current scandal about Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis from the lawsuit surrounding Janelle Grant, fans may have forgotten this is far from the first such scandal in the company. In fact, back in 1992, Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin were accused of having forced themselves on underage ring boys hired by WWE. Tom Cole, a former ring boy himself, brought the accusation. Phillips was fired by WWE, but then hired again while being asked to stay away from the children. Pat Patterson was also accused of making sexual gestures at the young underage boys. Phillips died in 2012 and had mostly stepped away from public life after the accusations. He was the one that had the job of recruiting ring boys, some of whom were only 13, to set up the ring for matches. A former employee said that the McMahons knew but didn't do anything about it. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess, the source continued, his voice breaking a bit. The McMahons, the source suspected, clearly knew what was going on but really did nothing to stop it. There was not a damn thing we could do about it. Cole would eventually commit suicide in 2021. His brother has continued to speak about the truth, but mostly this has been largely forgotten by the general wrestling audience. Fans are now seeing WWE as the largest player in the game and often forget that was not always the case. Black Saturday started off the infamous WCW and WWE rivalry that would much later turn into the Monday Night Wars. Vince McMahon wanted to establish his supremacy and was trying to get on the bigger networks. He had a deal with USA Network, but TBS was broadcasting WCW and he wanted that too. Ted Turner didn't want Vince McMahon to get that show, so he ended up buying out GCW shares, also known as WCW, and only Ole Anderson didn't sell. Fans tuned in Saturday to see their usual show, but instead they saw WWE. WWE was cartoonish then and opposite of WCW, and they didn't want to see that. The ratings were horrible and the network received a lot of fan complaints. Jim Crockett ended up buying the slot for $1 million, but Vince got his profit from that deal. This was the sure sign that Vince McMahon wanted to totally control all of wrestling, and for wrestling fans was the biggest scandal of the time. This is one of these scandals that most fans are aware of, but there are too few details to really talk about. The details will always remain a mystery unless Stephanie chooses to open up, which seems unlikely. Randy Savage left WWE in 1994, and most fans thought he would return to the company eventually. Most of McMahon's hated enemies returned to the company, but Randy Savage never did. There was a rumor that Savage and Stephanie were involved with each other romantically. Stephanie was almost underage when this happened and just turned 18. The story was that the two were in a romantic relationship and were hooking up, but Vince McMahon found out and he made Savage leave the company. Randy Savage's ex, Stephanie Bellers, also said that this story was true. She said that Savage accidentally told her everything but didn't reveal what it was. She went on to imply that the scandal was a true one. One of the most memorable stories from WWE history is the Pillmans Gun Angle. However, it's a story whose consequences are almost always forgotten by fans. Raw saw Stone Cold break into Pillman's house. Pillman then drew a gun on Steve Austin, threatening to kill him. The screen went black after an apparent gunshot. There was a huge backlash from viewers, where USA Network even talked about canceling Raw from its lineup. While the story was extremely interesting, it almost ended the Monday Night Wars there and then. WWE apologized a lot, and in the end they remained on the air. The first WWE steroid scandal is well remembered. The picture of Mr. McMahon going into court in a neck brace is famous. It's one of those things that everyone knows about. However, even though the second scandal is far more recent and had far-reaching consequences, fans often forget about it. In 2007, a steroid scandal came out that linked a number of WWE stars to a pharmacy in Florida that was selling drugs to a lot of the roster at the time. The names were some of the biggest too, including Kurt Angle, Batista, Booker T, Edge, John Morrison, and others. WWE defended Batista, but Booker T maintained he was innocent and he ended up leaving the company for some time later that year. This scandal is almost forgotten, although it was one of the things that saw the rise of the wellness policy. This and the Benoit murder scandal together saw WWE finally decide on going PG to give a clean image, with John Cena becoming the face of the company with his hustle, loyalty, and respect approach. And these were wrestling scandals that fans forgot about. I hope you're all having a great day. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all later.